everyone, and welcome to the Imagining a New We video blog with me, Dr. Samantha Cutrara, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more transformative, meaningful, and inclusive for their students. It is week 3 of a pandemic, social isolation, quarantine. Are we having fun yet? I'm sorry if that was a triggering question. You know, it's been a really weird time, and last week I posted a video that said, like, how do we teach history after this? And you know, it was a little morose. I mean, even I recognize that, but I got such a great response from teachers like you, from historians, from archivists, from a whole bunch of people that were like, yeah, we're thinking of these questions too. And one of the first people that I thought of during this pandemic period was a teacher that I worked with when I worked at the Archives of Ontario by the name of Neil Orford. He was a teacher for the Dufferin County Board. He's retired now, and he was a Governor General Award winner, and he created this really cool project, this Defining Moments project on the Spanish flu, when we were commemorating it a couple years ago. And so today we are going to chat with Neil. He's going to tell us more about the project, what you can learn from the Spanish flu to be able to bring into your classrooms whenever we get back, and how you can use this Defining Moments project and their lesson plans and their structure of teaching to help you more with teaching in this new world. So let's meet Neil. I'm so glad to talk with you today, Neil. Thank you so much for getting in touch. I've been thinking about you so much because of the resources that you created regarding the Spanish flu. So I was hoping we could talk about that and the Defining Moments project today. But before that, do you want to introduce yourself to everyone?
Sure. It's great to see you, Samantha. I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. I love the videos, and thank you for producing them, especially at this time when a lot of teachers are thinking about getting back to the classroom and considering what they're going to do and how they're going to approach their subject and approach their classes, because it's going to be a little bit of not just catching up, but a little bit of reframing what classroom practice looks like when everybody gets back together, however it is that we get back together. So this is a cool opportunity for me. So I was, the most important thing about me is that I was a history teacher for 31 and a half years in the Ontario system, teaching high school in a small town, not an urban setting at all, small town setting. And that over the course of those years, I spent a lot of time developing practices that I thought were going to be needed for the future. So as much as I was in the present, I was always trying to look for what the next, the next wave was, as it were. And towards the end of my career, I started a project called the Digital Historian Project, which was a blended learning experience for history students to actually take them out of the school and put them in the environment of a museum and practice digital curation around important points in Canadian history. And that kind of became...
And that's where we met, the beginning.
That's where we met.
That project, yeah, because I was at the Archives of Ontario and you were just starting that. So I think I got to see your students, or was it one of my colleagues, to just do that introduction to the archives before getting into the digital stuff.
That's right. No, it was you.
Yeah.
So you were right there at the ground floor of everything we were doing. And of course, the Archives of Ontario became a really important inspiration for the work we were doing. And so that lasted for about 4 years, and it really became the genesis for Defining Moments Canada when I retired. And the work that we're now doing under contract with the federal government of Canada.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And like, you have been awarded for this work, right? Like, don't miss that part. Like, you won the Governor General Award for History Teaching. Was it related to the digital history work?
It was at the time, and thank you, though that was very nice. At the time that award came my way, found me, it was largely because of a project that we were doing through Digital Historian to honor veterans. And we were using really the first rollout of robust data from Library and Archives Canada and from other sources to put students, to put in front of students. And we also utilized a lot of existing databases that were at University of Guelph and a couple of other universities, where a lot of historians had been working on ways in which they could isolate subsets of First World War soldiers and develop inferences and develop whole understandings based upon the data, and making as many conclusions as we could come to from data that was now increasingly available online. And so that really became, you know, a really important backdrop for what we were doing in Digital Historian. And we ended up being able to utilize a lot of that data for the work that students were doing and actually turn it into really cool data management projects for grade 12 data management math students. And so there was this neat little marriage of history and math that we were doing in Digital Historian for about 4 years.
Yeah, I always thought that was really cool. I love that part of your project, that integration of the different subjects, different disciplines, because so often we keep things separate. And you know, one of the things I talk about in a lot of the videos is ways to have increasing circles of inclusion. And I think part of that is these different subjects as well.
Exactly.
One of the videos I was actually going to post like during March break, which became the pandemic pause, was about digital history, because I was working with York on the digital humanities book. And so we should talk about that more. That might be a really interesting conversation to continue. But let's switch over to the Spanish flu, shall we?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very timely, isn't it?
It is. So I'm going to make a confession. I only heard about the Spanish flu when you started talking about it. And that was like, you know, around the World War I commemoration, so 2014, 2015. But I don't think I ever really learned about it or know about it. And so when all this, the discussion about pandemic started and that word was being used, I immediately thought of your project. And I immediately thought of linking people to it. And so there's another video that has resources related to the Spanish flu, and your resource is a very prominent one. Because you know the topic so intimately, what do you think about the knowledge of, like, what did we learn about the pandemic, the Spanish flu in 1918? How can we use some of that knowledge to help students now understand this pandemic moment that we're in?
Well, thanks, Samantha. I would say that you're in the 99% of Canadians, maybe 99.5% of Canadians, who, if they were asked, would confess the same thing about the Spanish flu pandemic before the last 3 weeks.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
Sadly.
It is. I think it would be difficult to argue now that it isn't a defining moment in Canadian history. It always has been. Mm-hmm. But one of the great lessons for teachers in working with students is this notion of amnesia, of cultural amnesia in history. That there are moments that we, for one reason or another, or a multiplicity of factors, find very convenient to forget. The Spanish flu is perhaps in the 20th century one of the most prominent defining moments, not just in Canada but around the world, that suffered from that public amnesia. Now, there's all kinds of scholarship that's been written about that sense of amnesia around it. And I think that's really poignant now in 2020 to reflect upon. Most of those authors, most of those scholars would argue that there was a tremendous amount of shame that, well, let's be specific about it and say a tremendous amount of shame that Canadians felt after the pandemic because of their inability to manage it, their inability to deal with it, their inability to, in the 20th century, have predicted it, have managed it, have come through it without the kinds of tragic consequences and tragic statistics that we experienced. And of course, for teachers, I would always encourage them to approach a topic like the Spanish flu using the historical thinking concepts and really target, continuity and change with the Spanish flu pandemic. There's a tremendous amount of continuity to researching and understanding the pandemic, and also a tremendous amount of change. There are lots of things that are similar that we can draw parallels to with COVID-19. There's also a tremendous amount that's different. The context of 1918, 1919 was a wartime, and the post-war disillusionment that a lot of Canadians were experiencing, into which this Spanish flu happened. Whereas today we're largely at peace in Canada, so there are differences there. And of course, the world of 1918, people were transporting themselves by train. There wasn't the kind of social media that there is today, so there are tremendous differences. So I would always try to emphasize a topic like the Spanish flu refracted through the lens of continuity and change.
That's really interesting, and I'm sharing the screen right now about the teaching about the Spanish flu. I'm kind of, I was thinking about, and this comes up in the video, about like how do we go about teaching history after this? Is like we can say we teach history because of to like learn the lessons from the past, and it's interesting because you didn't really say that. And in that video too, I also said like, okay, we can say that, but like we're in it now. So what do we do now that we're in it now? And so could you like name a couple or a few different lessons that history teachers can share with their students to understand this? And I know we can bring in the historical thinking concepts and continuity and change, but like, what are some like distilling some key lessons that we can really pull from this?
Sure. I think we have a lot of lessons from a lot of different subject disciplines on the website, because we really understand, we want everybody to understand the Spanish flu refracted through an interdisciplinary lens, that we can approach it from multiple perspectives. It's not just a historical experience. It's also an experience of scientific achievement and medical breakthroughs. It's an experience of reconsidering food and nutrition. There's no question that people who were physically healthier had a better chance of survival from the Spanish flu. So there's all kinds of different lenses that we can look at the Spanish flu.
Yeah,
through.
I love that. I love I know that was just the beginning of your answer, but I love that as a way to again think about bringing down some of those barriers between like history and then other things.
Yeah, and Samantha, if I was coming back to the class with students, I probably would bring in Alice Munro's short story about the Spanish flu, in which, or Albert Camus' play about the Spanish flu, and I'd bring in some literary experiences, and of course from an artistic standpoint, that great iconic painting by Edvard Munch of The Scream was set in the context of how the pandemic was ravaging Scandinavia. So I think there's a lot of angles that we can come to for understanding the flu. That's the first thing. I would also say to teachers that a lot of our lessons on the website are about the successful management of coming through the flu. From a history teacher's point of view, one of the ways that Canadians were so successful at managing and surviving the Spanish flu pandemic over the course of its 3 successive waves was that we had been on a wartime footing for 5 years. So what we're experiencing today with the Quarantine Act and the Emergencies Act, which of course was once known as the War Measures Act, Canadians were very familiar with in 1918 and 1919 because the whole country had been living under the government's controls and really severe regulation for 4 or 5 years. So when healthcare professionals and hospitals and nurses and the early forms of public health institutions in 1918-19 came to dealing with the flu, they were very well prepared to tackle it because of that war footing that Canada had been on. And, you know, we don't want in a democracy to be thinking about that kind of severe restrictedness. But when it comes to understanding the pandemic that we're in right now, it's really important to go back to moments in our history, such as the First World War, where Canadians did survive. To a certain extent, they thrived. And they came through the experience the other end, perhaps the better for the kind of regulation and restrictions that they were experiencing at the time. Now, there's a big downside to that, and we certainly don't want to forget the implications of wartime restrictions. And those are very important lessons for what we're living through right now as well, because there is a downside to it. And for many communities in Canada, they experienced the blunt edge of the force that came from governmental restrictions. Right, one hopes that isn't going to be the case today, but it is within the realm of possibility. So I would certainly be talking about that with my students when I get back. I also would encourage you as teachers to pay attention to the remarkable stories that we have on our website of the women who were asked in many cases from their communities to volunteer to step up and become nurses. And although many of them had no formal training whatsoever, some of them had done that role informally through activities involved in the war, you know, through the IODE or the Women's Institute. But when it came to the pandemic in communities across Canada, a lot of women were called upon to step into the breach and become volunteer nurses and triage communities, you know, on their front porches, in church basements, in community halls, all across the country. There are stories of women really taking leadership roles while, you know, men are still off at the front and they're slowly starting to come back, but they're really in no position to perform the duties that women were asked to perform in helping Canadians get through the pandemic.
But I think though, and like, I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I don't think it's just because men were away at war, which is often how we include women in narratives related to like the homestead, right? Yeah. But that this was care work, and that women have always been at the front lines of care work. So Absolutely. This was a way to expand a lot of the care work that they were already doing, but in a more structured way.
You know, the inclusiveness element that you speak about so often is so important here. And we spent some time doing the best we could with Defining Moments Canada to identify a really strong Indigenous narrative. It was really tough. I mean, this is another sort of subsequent lesson that we could talk about, but how difficult it was for us to establish those narratives because the data is so fractious, the data is so flawed, the data is so absent in many cases. We have a lot of great historians in the country, sociologists, epidemiologists, historians, who have written about the impact of the flu pandemic on Indigenous communities across Canada. Canadians need to appreciate how the pandemic devastated Indigenous communities 100 years ago, like just devastated the communities. And I think we're hearing a lot today about the potential impact not being that different from Indigenous communities across Canada were COVID-19 to make their way into Indigenous communities. And you know, we've seen Nunavut essentially close its borders for very good reason. And if we go back 100 years, there's a lot of lessons there as to why that's a very wise idea.
Mm-hmm. That's so important to bring in. I think of this article I read in 2005 around the election, the federal election, in McLean, that said, like, we're not really a nation unless we care about the fact that so many First Nations don't have running water. And I think that, you know, so many of us that have a relative amount of privilege, that we can hoard toilet paper if that is how we're choosing to deal with our anxiety, to be able to really think about people that just don't have the structural resources to be able to fight this in the ways that that we might be gravitating towards. So thank you for that, and I'll make sure to put the links to everything that you're talking about below the video so that people can explore that a little bit more.
Thank you.
So before we wrap up, maybe you could talk a little bit, just really quickly, about the Defining Moments project and its approach to history teaching generally. I know I really advocate for, like, emotional, affective teaching and learning, connection, complexity, and care. And when I see your 7-sentence story structure, for example, and I'm going to flip over to my screen right now, I find a lot of resonance in that. I really like this idea about story. And so maybe you can talk a little bit more about Defining Moments, just as a way to kind of conclude our talk for today.
Sure. Well, thank you for concentrating on 7-sentence story structure. We designed that actually at the very start with ESL students in mind.
Interesting. That's really interesting.
Yeah. We felt, I mean, story, you're absolutely right. Story is so important to everything that we do in history. But we also felt that if we were going to approach these moments in Canadian history that largely have gone unnoticed, or and this is sort of circling back to where we started with so many Canadians not knowing about the flu pandemic.
Right.
If we were going to introduce these moments in Canadian history that have been overlooked or suffer from public amnesia or cultural amnesia, and spend time with our students on it, we needed to make sure that every one of the students in our classrooms, regardless of whether they were in urban settings or rural settings, had a model or a methodology or a pathway to approach good storytelling. So the 7-sentence story structure came out of that, and we felt very strongly that if we could work with teachers to develop this as a protocol, as a habit of mind, you know, good metacognitive strategy for students to really concentrate on building story around 7 building blocks, then any topic that a student approached, whether it was in history or in language arts or in science or in food and nutrition class, could be approached the same way. So we really saw this as a transferable skill. And that's foundational to what we do at Defining Moments Canada, is we want to put 21st century digital learning tools in the hands of teachers so that we can help students become what we're calling the most competent digital curators in Canada. We want every one of the students who engages with our projects to become citizen curators. We want them to go out into their communities across Canada and find the stories about the topic that we're concentrating on, and build a narrative with their teachers about it as a form of commemoration. So if it's about our new project on the discovery of insulin, which is coming up next year, and we're already building that project right now, we know that across Canada, diabetes 100 years ago was ravaging this country. And we know that in communities large and small, from precarious lifestyles right through to the more affluent Canadians, middle-class Canadians, we understand that there are stories that need to be retrieved from our archives, from our newspapers, from our libraries, even from our knowledge keepers, from our memories.
Yeah.
And we want students to, you know, to become our citizen curators, to bring those to their classrooms and begin to tell those stories. So the 7-sentence story structure becomes the methodology that we want every student to become comfortable with. So Defining Moments Canada is an interdisciplinary approach. We want as many science teachers and math teachers and food and nutrition teachers to be utilizing our resources as we do history teachers. Everything there on our platform is designed for the intermediate level student right through to the senior student across the country. We have a real social studies approach with some of our younger age products. And as we start to develop our new projects over the next few years, we're really going to be rolling out a lot of new tools for teachers to use. So, you know, the approach that we have is about taking our historical narrative that is popular and has, you know, driven the settler culture in Canada for all these years, and unpack it and discover the stories that are shared amongst Canadians in communities right across the country that do not get the kind of popular attention. And the Flute probably was the first example of that, but we know that there are so many more.
Yeah, and I mean, I know you know some of my work, and a lot of the stuff I do is around historic space, which is a methodology for teaching history and exploring history, where students like map out through a concept map, for example, key concepts or key ideas from a historical period. They like organize it, they learn about a couple of those things, but then most of the time is spent challenging that narrative through through artifacts, through oral histories, through primary sources. And so, I mean, just selfishly, I love this approach because it involves some of that challenge as like a key element for approaching history in a way that I know this is, you know, important for you too, that is really manageable for history teachers and kind of non-threatening for students, right? But also provides like a lot of really cool opportunities to go deeper, because we do know that students like to go deeper, but they need to feel safe and they need to feel supported and they need to feel like it is meaningful for them.
You're so right, Samantha. And, you know, working with students around asking some fundamentally simple but fundamentally important critical inquiry questions to, you know, to shape that understanding. And if you're using a concept map, just that's a perfect way of approaching it for kids, and engaging also conversation. And we want the kids as much as possible to be talking about this in class as they challenge the narratives, as they develop new thinking, as they branch out into different realms, to be chatting about this, talking about this, constantly conversing about it.
I talk a lot about connection, complexity, and care, right? Like those are the three foundations for meaningful learning, and that the Defining Moments approach really allows for all three of those things in really substantial ways. So thank you for your work on that. I'm so glad you put so much effort into it 2 years ago, or like 4 years ago. Who knew? I mean, I guess we all should have known or whatever, but it's been so great talking with you today. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome, Samantha, and keep doing all that you're doing. It's so good.
Well, that's great, and hopefully we'll have more opportunities to collaborate.
You betcha. Take care.
Bye. That was so great. Oh, it's so nice to be able to like talk with all of you in the community. Please let me know if you want to have a conversation, if you want to talk more about what teaching history might look like after this. I think it would be really cool for us to stay connected through this. So thank you for your emails and your direct messages. Let me know if you want to be interviewed just like Neil was, because I thought that was a really great conversation. Bye everyone, until next time.